Today, WTF just happened. Beyond left versus right. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analysis. One that is post covering finance and property news. Well, yesterday I went onto Adam Stokes' channel and we discussed the disturbing news from the US and got into a deep philosophical discussion about the meaning of life, politics, the left versus the right, is war coming, and a bunch of other issues too. Now, this is my edit of that conversation. Enjoy.
G'day viewers, I'm Adam Stokes. Welcome back to the channel where I'm having an emergency stream tonight with my good friend Martin North. We had actually planned to talk tonight, but of course there's been a political assassination in Utah in the United States over the last 24 hours. We can see machete attacks on children in Melbourne. We've got missile attacks from Israel on Qatar and a whole lot of other things. I'm trying to figure out what this all means and whether it's all a distraction from something bigger coming, if war is inevitable, if this is part of the economic cycle, what is going on in the world around us. So let's bring in our Sherpa through all of this madness. Martin North from Digital Financial Analytics, thank you so much for joining me, my good friend.
Hello, nice to be back and nice to be with you, even if the occasion is extremely sad and concerning. And I think, you need to set all of these issues in the context of where are we heading and what does it mean? Because those are the critical questions to ask. But we should also, of course, pause along the way just to reflect on, good lives lost and the sadness that results from it.
Yeah, thank you. And it's important that we discuss this with level heads, but of course there is a lot of emotion flying around the world at the moment because it wasn't just about one man dying. It was about a violent assassination of someone who was speaking. It's about the reaction to that assassination. A lot of people on one side of politics are dancing on the grave of a dead man and celebrating violence. A lot of other people are saying, well, how long do we tolerate violence from one party against another? Others are speaking, well, is it only one side of politics? Is it both sides of politics? And of course, on the global stage, what I really want to do is just quickly give a quick summary of what I'm tracking around the world. Okay, so we've had obviously a shooting in Utah, Charlie Kirk fatally shot by rooftop sniper. In July, in Angola, fuel price protests turned violent with police clashes. In Kenya, we had a one-year anniversary with anti-government protests. We've had India, Pakistan, the Kashmir border conflict. In Yemen in March, US warplanes carried out airstrikes. Again in Yemen in September, Israel airstrike killed Sana'a. And then we also had, of course, Israel launching missiles against Qatar. We've also had Israel and Iran. We've got machete attacks in Melbourne. We've got the Red Sea dispute, again, with Yemen and Houthi rebels. And then, in, of course, Ukraine, we've got Russian drones and missile strikes in Kiev and vice versa across that border. That war is still going on. We've got China and Taiwan. In Armenia, we've got security forces detained a prominent archbishop. In Nepal, we've got mass anti-corruption protests happening. In Poland, we've got Polish and NATO jets shooting down multiple drones entering Polish airspace. We've also got repeated Israeli strikes on Houthi-controlled targets. The list just goes on. The list is absolutely massive. As we can see, we've got a fair bit of emotion out there, understandably. And we was talking before we started the show tonight. My concern is it's coming from one side. But I bring you on here. You are older. I think you're a little bit older than me. You're wiser than me. You've been around a lot longer than me. And you're a much better philosopher than me. So I think it's important that we have level heads and start talking about this. But my take is this, and I am happy to explore where we are. I see a lot of violence coming from the left. I see a lot of allegations that there's a lot of violence coming from the right. But I don't see the violence coming from the right. I see the abuse against the right. I see the intolerance of the right. I see the accusations against the right. But what I see coming from the left is two assassination attempts on the president. When people speak, they can get shot in the throat, as we saw over the last 24 hours. We can see the glorification of violence by left leaders. Well, I should really say Democrat leaders in the United States saying we need to punch people in the face, we need to be violent. We can see that when recently that poor Ukrainian immigrant in the United States was stabbed in the throat by a black person. It's like, well, how do we help the black person? But if it's violence the other way, it's like, well, there's riots on the street, there's Black Lives Matter. So in my experience, what I'm seeing is a lot of violence coming from one side of politics and the other side of politics sitting quietly and, if you will, being tolerant, whilst the other side is saying we're about love, inclusion and tolerance. But as I understand it, you believe, and perhaps I'm not seeing it, that there is an equal amount of violence coming from the left and the right. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so my perspective, and look, I'm touching 70 now, so I've been around a bit over recent years, and sort of watched a few of these cycles come before. My belief is that it's a little bit more complicated than just saying it's left or it's right, and all the people on the right are doing something, all the people on the left are doing something. There is clearly a gradation, across politics, and some have a more, market-driven, conservative view of the world. Others have a different view of the world. But I believe that if you look hard enough, you can also see the same violent tendencies amongst elements on the right of politics as well as on the left of politics. And so I think we need to move beyond that simple, it's left or it's right. Let's face it, we know that there is a lot of pain out there in many communities, not just in Australia, but around the world, the US, the UK, etc., etc. We also know that a lot of people feel that the world is falling apart. And when you look at our leaders, those who are in power and those who aspire to be in power, they seem unable or unwilling to solve the issues that we think are really important. And because of that, there's a growing, if you like, tendency to want to say, hang on, this isn't right, we've got to find a different way forward. Now, when you start thinking about we've got to find a different way forward, obviously the best solution is to have a conversation about it and have a debate about it. And I'm very keen to have debates on these issues. And philosophy is about exploring these things relatively peacefully. Unfortunately, what we've got now is the point where violence has become just part of, quote, the debate, unquote. And that, for me, is the real problem we need to think about. Why is it that now violence has become so wired into the way that everybody acts and talks and thinks? And then you talk about, the right or the left, etc., etc. So to me, there's a bigger question here than which side of politics. It's why have things gone, one, polarized, and two, off the rails for so many people? That's the question I think we should be asking. I think the violent response is a signal of frustration and a sense that things are not working. And so the real question for me is, well, why are things not working? Is it deliberate? Are there people who are setting this up deliberately? Is the propagation of violence something which actually people are encouraging? Is it the fact that guns are much easier to grab in the US, and that's why we see more gunfire, etc., etc.? But look at the violence in other places. I was noticing that, over the last 2 or 3 days up in Asia, there've been violence there around the government in one of those important countries there. So there's a bigger question. Why is it that everybody feels it's falling apart?
To me, I think the question is who's in charge. So I'm not sure if you've read the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman. You have read it?
Yep.
Yeah, very, very powerful book. I think I did talk to you about it before. For those of you who haven't read it, it's basically about, in simple terms, there is no loyalty to a nation. There is loyalty to profits. There is loyalty to how do I make as much money as possible, whether it's sparking civil unrest or international unrest, and creating conditions that have no loyalty to a country, no loyalty to people, but a pure focus on profits. Now, the question I've been asking on this channel for many years is who's in charge. I'm not convinced that the political power, whoever it may be, left or right, is in charge of the country. My shifting point of that was when I saw Kevin Rudd try to put a super tax on big companies that were basically pulling a lot of minerals out of the ground, and then within hours, if you will, he was sacked. And to me, that was a big slap in my face. It's like, oh, the Prime Minister's not in charge, because if he actually tries to take profits out of the ground, our ground, he gets sacked. Recently, you can see Jacinta Price also got sacked to an extent because she didn't back down on what I would suggest was a mathematical fact, where a certain group of people vote a certain way, and she stated that mathematical fact, which can absolutely be substantiated.
Yep.
And a black woman was accused by a white woman of being racist, even though in the past I thought they were saying that black people can't be racist. And I'm like, well, hang on, this is a bit interesting. And now mathematics is racist. And so then you start to think, well, yeah, what is going on? What is the tipping point? Now, is it all about money? For the viewers out there, if you don't know, Martin is a very good philosopher. He's next level philosopher. And I didn't actually realize that about Martin until we got into deep conversations over many years, and we could understand how we could do so many thought experiments and challenge each other's ideas without getting upset. And you can see now that when people's ideas are challenged, you could probably expect a bullet in the throat or a bullet in the head or some type of violence in the street. And we've now gone to the point that we can't even talk. Now we extend this further to what you were saying, is maybe it's not so black and white where it's left and right. That is, we can see over time in history that there's been so much division in culture. That is male, female, black, white, gay, straight, cis, non-cis, as in hetero. I'll just leave it at that, because even just saying these words can upset some people. Immigrants, non-immigrants, this religion, that religion. And now that every single time there seems to be a breakdown in a culture or in a division in a society, it makes us weaker and weaker. When I lived in Korea, it was very much a monoculture. Maybe a little bit in Spain, but Korea was the most, if you will, monoculture, just a term I've made up, where it wasn't multicultural, it was singular culture with some expats coming in. When I lived in the Middle East, it was very much multicultural, but the leading culture at the top had very strict rules. And everyone played by those rules. And if you didn't play by the rules of the Middle Easterners, you would face the consequences. When I lived in America, England, and Australia, I can see that, well, actually the main culture, or the host nation culture per se, they would always have to bend and say, well, this might offend our guest. This might offend the new culture that's coming in. So as I live, not visit, but live around the world, I see in certain nations, the monocultures seem to have less friction, in my observation. The harsher culture, not harsher, perhaps more traditional cultures like the Middle East, they say, hey, you're welcome here. But if you mess with our rules, with our culture, with our religion, you will face the consequences. And then in the Western cultures, we're like, well, it doesn't matter what we think. What's really important is what our guests think and feel. And then when a minority comes in, if you will, they seem to have the bigger say. So the smaller you are, the smaller of a group you are, the more of a right you have to be offended, and the more of a right you have to be angry, and the less of a voice the rest of the people have. Am I imagining this, or is this by design?
Well, I think you've missed out the big polarization, and that's the rich versus the poor. And the people who are effectively in servitude and the people who are effectively receiving the goods. And I would argue, if you go back into history and look at Greece, Rome, the Middle Ages, it's the same as then as now, that there are some people who are doing extremely well on the backs of a lot of people not doing very well. There are a lot of people who are in debt servitude today. In previous generations, they would perhaps be in a different sort of servitude. It seems to me that what the basic polarization is, you've got a small cabal who are actually saying, we quite like the way things are. We're making a lot of money, we're feeling quite wealthy, and we can pull all the strings. And then there are a bunch of people who are looking outside in, saying, well, hang on a minute, it's not like my experience at all. I'm actually not feeling pretty flash about things. And in fact, if you take a very simple example, as I sometimes quote, do you work to live or live to work? Well, a lot of people work to survive. And, it's dressed up with technology, and it's dressed up with different language than what it was back in the land of the Greeks, but it's still slavery, really. And so there's a basic fundamental question here about fairness and equity versus slavery and the people calling the shots. And I would say that a lot of the issues that we're coming to is not racist particularly. Reaction to race is partly precipitated by people feeling this innate unfairness about the way that society works and the way that it seems to be that the people at the top always get the prize. They have an easy life, etc., and everybody else is, running really, really hard just to stand still. So I think there's that basic problem. The other point I'd make is we've got now much more transparency in terms of ideas and opinions. If you think back 2 or 3 decades, you had a few newspapers, you had 1 or 2 TV channels, and that was it. But now you've got this minefield of different social media, different algos propagating it. And I think you can sheet a lot of the issues that we've got to the big corps, and particularly the big tech companies, because they are ruling the roost. You look at their profits, but also look at the way that they use their algorithms. They want to stoke disagreement. They want to stoke debate. They want to stoke eyeballs. They want to stoke people staying on sites like YouTube, right? They want that because that's how they make their money. So there is a commercial imperative now sitting above this servitude problem. And that commercial imperative is just turning up the volume to 11 so that people get more and more and more frustrated. And then we have a political class who I think are innately incompetent compared with perhaps a few generations back, and are unwilling or unable to deal with those critical broader issues, the policy issues that we should be addressing, migration being perhaps one that we could touch on a bit later. The politicians are hopeless, and the politicians, of course, then try and dial back social media because they don't want to be criticized, but they're part of the problem. So you've got this DNA bubbling on below the surface. I would argue that if you actually went back to tackle some of those underlying structural issues, we'd actually have a much easier journey towards the right outcomes. But you also have to recognize that out there in the world, there are always people who are innately greedy, evil, whatever you want to say. And there are people who actually believe that their grasp on power isn't enough and they want more. That's been another human trait. So we are at the end of the day coming to a question, which is how much of this is innate in human nature?
You can see in history this, of course, I know seems to repeat itself. I've got a super chat here which must take priority. Thank you to Kawini. Thank you, Adam. I think many of us need to be able to talk about what happened to Charlie today. We feel sad, yet we never knew him. And the world doesn't feel safe. Then here at home, the government hates us. Makes you wonder. So just I thank you for the super chat there, Kawini. So on that comment that the government hates us, I don't feel like my government likes me. Now, it's my interpretation. It's my feeling. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but I don't know. I think I'm allowed to speak my truth. I always feel like a second-class citizen in my own country. I feel like that I'm not welcome here. I have to apologize for my existence. I have to pretend that I'm apologetic, or I have to be apologetic for being white and being in this country, even though I think I'm a 7th or 8th generation Australian here. I was born here. My mother was born here. My grandmother was born here. My great-grandmother was born here. And yet I'm told that I'm an invader and I shouldn't be celebrating Australia Day, and flying the flag makes me a right-wing Nazi. And it's like, well, hang on a second. When I was in uniform, wearing the flag on my uniform, that didn't make me a right-wing Nazi. But if I fly the flag in my street, then I am a right-wing Nazi. And none of this seems to make sense. When we can see a foreign group, if you will, Palestinians march across a Sydney Harbour Bridge, it's like, or those in support of Palestine, it's like, well, this is a good thing. But when Australians march with flags in their capital cities, the government says, well, that's un-Australian. And it's like, well, hang on, I'm genuinely trying to understand. If foreigners flying their flag in this country is a good thing, but Australians flying their flags in here is a racist thing, is it all just smoke and mirrors? Is it all just saying, well, okay, as you said, it's just the rich playing us? But then I take the question a bit further. If it is the rich playing us, well, the politicians on paper aren't particularly rich. as in their wages don't equal what commercial industries are getting. But we can see historically, you go into politics on a wage of a couple of $100,000, even $500,000 a year, and then you leave politics as a multi-millionaire. In some instances in the United States, as an example, they're leaving politics as a billionaire. It's like, well, hang on a second. You came into this job with a few $100,000. You're not some property tycoon. You're not a special investor, but then when you actually leave politics, you're now a multi-millionaire or a billionaire. And we can see Nancy Pelosi is a good example of that. Never really been a trader in her life, always been a politician, and somehow managed to be the best trader on planet Earth. And then you see that the lobbyist, and it's like, well, hang on a second, if you've got lobbyists paying the government to do as they're told, and the minor parties are suppressed, and then you have the left of the right and right of politics in Australia when it comes to political debates. They've only got two people on stage, and it's like, well, this isn't a two-party system in Australia. There's multiple parties that can be here, and yet it's presented to us that only Labor or Liberal can win. And then I'll wrap up this long rant with this. We then see Dan Andrews, the former Premier of Victoria, shaking hands with the communist leader of China. It's nothing against China, we do a lot of trade with them, we've got good relations with them, but Dan Andrews is a former politician, and I see him in a formal photo with the leader of North Korea, the leader of Russia, who we're kind of at war with, the proxy war, I don't know, depends who you ask and depends what's politically correct, and he's on stage with Xi Jinping, and I'm thinking, well, who's in charge, and at what stage is there an overlap in leading your country and then taking perhaps bribes, which then links to, of course, we can see the chairman's lounge of Qantas, a private for-profit entity that gives very attractive fiscal deals in the form of the chairman's lounge to Australian politicians. And then the extension of that is that we can see that during the COVID lockdowns, Qantas was found guilty of sacking a lot of people that they shouldn't have sacked. And it's just like, well, is the corruption right in front of us everywhere? Am I exaggerating? Can you bring some sense to what I'm seeing in all of that commentary there?
I'm not sure about sense, but your question is dead right. And the truth is that the politicians around the place, including Australia, are fundamentally under the thumb of the big corporations. And you can talk about the banks and the way that they lobby and how they threaten the politicians. You can talk about big oil, big gas. They have the power. The reason they have the power is because, of course, they have the ability to invest or not invest. They have the ability to hire and fire, and a lot of revolving doors, as you say, from politics. Look at who went into the defense industries, just a few people, ScoMo included, of course. So politicians ostensibly are elected to be our representatives and to make decisions on the behalf of us as the people. That's the theory of the way that democracy works. In practice, politicians don't do that, because as soon as they get within the system, what they actually begin to realize is that whatever naivety you might have had on the way in, and I've spoken to a number of politicians who really believed that they'd be able to make a difference. When you actually understand the way that the political structure works and the way that things like the Treasury works and the way that big corporations are pushing and inserting ideas and lobbying, it's not surprising that politicians then back off. And remember what I said earlier on about the servitude, the slavery, right? We have modern day slavery. And I don't just mean those who unfortunately are really trapped in slavery. I mean most people, the majority of people in Australia are effectively working because they've got no choice but to work to live. And the political system relies on that. We pay taxes. We pay way more taxes than we should because of bad decisions made by governments. If governments had made better decisions, for example, around gas, we would have had lower inflation, lower energy prices, and a better economy. But no, they couldn't do that because that would have upset the big multinational gas corporations. Or again, if you think about the supermarkets, we have a couple of supermarkets who own the high street, and we pay way more than we should for our goods in those high streets simply because of the structure of the industry. Nobody is prepared to tackle that. Or another one, think of the banks, think of the financial system, think of the way that works. Again, the financial system is engineered to create you being dependent on them forever. You pay your mortgage, or if you're renting, you pay your rent. And I keep coming up against this concept now of the idea of the subscription world that you're in. You've got subscription housing, you've got subscription this, subscription that. So the idea is you will pay and you will continue to pay ad infinitum forever. Now, that's part of this idea that people are now saying, get queasy on this. This doesn't seem fair because I'm basically paying more and more and more for less and less and less. I have to work harder and harder and harder, whilst the politicians don't seem to care. And your earlier question was, do they care? No, they don't. Because they have a different agenda. Now, their agenda is partly to stay in power. Remember, politicians will do anything to get elected and to get re-elected. They will say anything, they will do anything. So whatever truth they might hold personally, they often have to give it up in parts. And I've spoken to a number of very senior politicians and ex-politicians who have to admit that they compromise their core values to maintain power. So it becomes a game of power. Once you realize that there's a game of power, then you ask, well, who are the powerful? Takes you right back to those corporates again. And so my perspective on all of this is it's governments have a bit of a damp end of a stick, actually, because it's the corporates that are pulling the shots. That's where the corruption is. But nobody wants to talk about that. No one dare talk about it. Now, think about the financial system, right? We have massively high home prices at the moment. We have massive amounts of debt around the world. Who are the winners? They are the big financial players who are basically buying and trading and selling the volatility and making a huge amount of money. That and the big financial firms, that and the big tech firms, they are where all the assets, all the affluence is accreting to. It's just like the old emperors back in Greece or Rome. It's just like they had this sort of surrounding small number of affluent people who really called the shots. Nothing has changed.
It makes me wonder what the tipping point is then. So you can see assassination attempts against the president in the United States. You can see political per se assassinations, not physically, but in the position in Australia where we had this rotating door of prime ministers at one time. A few years ago, if you remember, it felt like every day you'd wake up and there was a different prime minister. And in England, they went through that as well, that it wasn't an election, but the party itself was sacking the prime minister. And you and I have spoken about this before, about this dual puppet system where you have the people. So you've got the prime minister in the middle in this example, in this metaphoric example. You've got the people underneath who are the voters, and then you've got the party at the top who can sack the prime minister. But in the analogy that I gave many years ago when we first discussed this, what I failed to see in all of that was, in fact, above all of that is you've got the lobbyists, those with money. And they control the party at the top with the
Correct.
lobbying, sponsorship / bribery, and they control the people at the bottom through the media, through the centralised media. And that is why we can see when we had the MAD bill coming in, where you and I, our values again first aligned, with the cash ban and then moving on to the MAD bill, as well as learning what the alternative is. If you have the lobbyists at the top who are invisible and bribe or tell or pay the government, whatever verb you want to use, that you will do this or you will lose your job, then you've got those same people controlling the media at the bottom saying, this will be the narrative, you will say what we tell you to say or you'll lose your job. And now you've got the social media, which was like the evolution, if you will, where free speech could actually flourish again. And then the government came in and said, no, we determine what the truth is. We're going to say anything that is not spoken outside the banks, the government, the universities, or us, that's misinformation and disinformation, and there'll be consequences for that. And then that was stopped and say, right, well, now we're going to get you because we really want to protect the children. Don't worry about the children who are getting slaughtered with machetes. What we really want to do is we want to protect the children from a mean tweet or post. So we're now going to introduce an identification thing to, look, in my opinion, it's not to protect the children. It's just another control of social media. They tried to stop social media through the MAD bill. That didn't work. And in my opinion, I could be wrong. It's now like, well, now we're going to have more control over what what social media says. And if you go back a step, you can remember or who watches social media and how they watch it, and we can monitor what they watch. If you recall, there was a big legal case between the Australian government, I think, and YouTube saying, well, you have to put our news outlets on your news channel. Can you expand on that one a bit? Where I'm not clear on it, but please clear it up for me. The government was telling YouTube you have to put on like Channel 9, Channel 10, Channel 7. You have to put our news on your platform, or there's going to be consequences.
Well, it goes back to, of course, the distribution arrangements. If you go back in history, right, you had a small number of free-to-air channels. Those free-to-air channels would carry government news and what have you, and government adverts. But because, of course, now people are spending much less and less time on those free-to-air channels, and they're spending much more time on YouTube. YouTube is now probably one of the most powerful media outlets ever, if you think of the proportion of people around the world who actually spend quite a lot of time on YouTube. So maybe not surprisingly, the government's saying, well, if you want to play that game, we still want to make sure that our messages can actually get out there. And of course, YouTube says, well, you can always pay for adverts. And they say, no, we don't want to do that. We want to we want to have a different mechanism. So it's part of this. This is, and it comes back to the fundamental question: what is truth, and who defines what truth is? And if you just pause and think about that at the moment, right? What is truth, and who defines truth? Because truth is a bit illusory. Truth is often defined by those in power. Truth is often defined by those with the loudest voices. But a lot of people, when they hear the truth, will say, well, that's not my experience. And where there's a disconnect, a discord between what people are actually experiencing and seeing and what truth is being projected by government via social media or whatever, that's when you start getting this contention. And I think a lot of the issues we're touching on comes back to the fact that there's a massive disconnect between what real ordinary people are experiencing day in, day out, and what the politicians are saying is true, or what even the big corporates are saying is true. And that's why it's a battle for the mind. Because at the end of the day, and I go back to 1984, to my mind, 1984 is the book you need to read at the moment, because 1984, Orwell's vision of the future wasn't a vision of the future. It was his concern about the way things were working at the time he wrote, before the Second World War, I think it was. The truth is actually owned by those who write it. The truth is owned by those who can actually distort it for whatever they want it to be. And the truth is something which can be then retrofitted and changed and altered to meet your agenda. That is what we are needing to think about, right? If you really want to know what's going on, ask yourself, who is writing the truth? Who is writing the story that you're actually watching or listening? What is their agenda?
Someone left a good comment here saying, Nikki James said, the killing of Kirk was to refuel the left and right argument. Society was nearly going to the top versus bottom mentality. So I think that's a very powerful comment, and it amplifies what you're saying before. So, and perhaps what I was talking about with the division of so many groups within society. I went through all these different divisions, and then you said, well, of course, you've forgotten the most important one, which is the wealthy versus the non-wealthy. And we can see, in my opinion, that the middle class is being decimated across the world.
Yep.
It used to be, quite common. Well, I always use my grandfather as an example. Blue collar worker, married with 7 children and a house and a car. That is mathematically impossible now. It is mathematically impossible. Now, when I say blue collar worker, it would be different perhaps if you had your own plumbing industry or electrical company.
It's the place to be.
And you could multiply your workforce. But I would suggest that when you become at that level, you're moving into white collar as an entrepreneur. I'm talking about, a guy or girl who rocks up to work, punches in 9 to 5, 40 hours a week, comes home. It is mathematically impossible to have 7 children and a partner and a car and a mortgage. The numbers just don't line up. That middle class is being decimated. So you've got the rich and the haves, and then you've got the have-nots, and then you've got the option of the welfare state in many instances where it's like, well, I'm never going to make it to the top. The middle class has been wiped out, so I'm just going to punch out and I'm going to take my stimmy check or my welfare check. And then the consequence of that is, well, you do as you're told and you don't really have a voice, and you'll always be on the lower run. So it's almost like this middle class is being decimated. Are you suggesting if there's the haves and the have-nots, and we can see in history there can be a revolution when that type of stuff happens. If they're hungry, we saw in the COVID lockdowns, if you couldn't get toilet paper, there was fights in supermarkets. But toilet paper is one thing. When it goes from toilet paper to food, if you can't afford to feed yourself or your family, if you thought violence over toilet paper was one thing, wait till you see the other. So then it goes back to the Roman times and the saying, bread and circus. As long as you've got your food and your Netflix, you'll crack on. Your thoughts?
Yeah. So I think the rise of the Netflix and those similar things, let's keep them educated, no, entertained, maybe, is a very significant part of it. And what I find fascinating is that people are, not everybody, but quite a few people are quite happy just to sit there and sort of just, absorb whatever Netflix or whatever else is going on with, not necessarily thinking much about what's going on. And what I find a little bit frustrating as a philosopher is a lot of people, either because they're too busy or because they're distracted or because they're just tired, don't actually ask some of these harder questions. Now, I guess the trouble is with asking hard questions is you may not like the answers that you want to see coming out. And that, I think, is quite often the case. So when I talk about some of the issues to do with housing, and start asking the question, so why is it that housing is a big problem? Well, it's deliberate. It's a policy. It's been done deliberately over several decades. So this isn't a happenstance. People don't want to hear that, right? What I find quite often is that when you start asking what is truth, and then you ask these hard questions, people say, "Oh, I'll get back to watching Netflix because that's easier. That's actually, a more comfortable place to be." And just occasionally, social media breaks through. I just want to put this up. Did you see this? This was actually the Banksy thing in London, right? This is the thing that came up a couple of days ago.
And have you seen they've wiped it off and now it's even better?
Correct, exactly right. This is before they cleaned it off, right? The point was, and this particular one just was fantastic because it shows you the lawyer basically just walking past as justice, So this is a comment on the way society works, which is there are some people who can actually set the agenda, set the rules, and everybody else has to follow on. That's fascinating because that particular thing got picked up in social media and amplified. They then tried to clean it off and claim that it's actually a building that has got special significance, so we need to actually clean it up, right? The truth is they couldn't handle the truth. And that's my broad question. Can you really handle the truth? Could you really handle the idea that we're running around like rats in a maze with people effectively calling the shots, making massive amounts of money off the back of it? Is it perhaps nicer to think, no, I'll just plow my own furrow. I'll keep working hard. I'll do, 9 till 5 or more. And that'll, now the truth is there is an agenda here. Like I say, can you really handle that truth? Once you realize it, it's like the red pill, blue pill conversation. I quite often quote The Matrix because I think it's a really important observation and commentary on society. Once you see how things really are working, then you get angry, right? And you get frustrated. And that's when some of these other things come up. Now, I believe that a lot of the issues, going right back to where we came into this, the violence we're seeing, the criticism of politicians and the anger on politicians is because people just don't feel that what's happening at the moment is fair or meaningful for them. But on the other hand, politicians aren't interested in that. And that's the major dilemma we have. And just as there are some leaders, dictators, call them what you want, who actually believe that they should have more power and more ability to say, thou shalt, I'll control the media, I'll control the story, I'll tell you what to do, I'll tell you what to think, I'll tell you what to believe. That is the path that many people look at and think, we don't want that. But on the other hand, how do you break out of it if in fact they hold all the cards? And that's where the frustration builds. And that's where, if we don't have good mechanisms to be able to debate these and talk about these things and begin to think of alternatives, you end up being ground into the ground, literally. And that's what I'm seeing at the moment. So a lot of the frustration is then vented, and you can see it, the crime statistics in Melbourne going up because the poverty is going up in Melbourne. You can see that there. The very significant numbers of violent events in the US, mostly with guns, because guns are so easily available. And of course, there are people on the right who believe that you should have perfect freedom to carry a gun wherever you want. I'm going back to that right-left thing, right? So the point is, this is a mess, right? It's a mess created by the human spirit, because this is how this human spirit operates. So it's not necessarily that surprising. And by the way, if you look in the apes, and you look at the evolution of the apes and the kingpin of the apes who stands there and tells everybody what to do, and then ultimately gets turned over by the next one, we're just apes.
Waiting for you. I've got some messages coming through that some people say my volume is low, others say it's high. I've just cranked it up a little bit, and I've put my microphone a little bit closer to my mouth, so hopefully that's a little bit better. But there's a comment here from Nikki James. It says, some days I wish it was the 90s again and we were content with being lied to.
Not knowing, yes.
Yeah, and then of course... Then you have, I was waiting for the Matrix, because, the Matrix, we talk about the blue pill. You take the blue pill and you go back to your lie and illusion. You don't even know you're in a lie. You just crack on.
Yes.
You take the red pill and you're going to see what's really happening around you. Now, of course, many of us have been red pilled. And then some people talk about the black pill, where the black pill is where it's just like the red pill, but then you become bitter about it. And it makes me think about, I remember years ago test driving a new car, and I remember speaking to the car dealer. He was a young guy, and he really knew his product. It was a new BMW M5, and he knew this product inside out. And we went for this test drive in this race car, and I remember him saying, I just want my life to be simple. He goes, all I'm going to do is, because he was very good at what he did, he just had to get to a certain amount of money. He already had a property that he had inherited. He had done very well in his life, and his girlfriend was actually not well, but he wanted to marry her and just look after her, and that's all he wanted to do. And I don't know why it sticks out in my head so much, maybe because when things get really stressful, I'm like, I wonder how that guy's going, because he said, I don't want the TV, I don't want internet, all I want to do is look after my partner and have a good life. And it sort of rings so true, because the more you seem to know, the more stressful life becomes. And you mentioned before about television versus YouTube. I haven't had TV in my house, as in I've got televisions in my properties, but I haven't had it connected to mainstream air. I can't remember the last time I had television connected in my house. I don't even bother connecting the aerial. Everything I do is online. Everything. Like from either watching it or creating it myself, as I am right now, or doing interactions with a creator such as yourself. And then I wonder also in that scene from The Matrix where that guy had this piece of steak, if you recall, he goes, I know this steak is not real. I know I'm just imagining it, but I know it tastes good. And he just wants to accept that reality. So it brings us back to the bread and circuses. In the big picture, so it all sounds quite doomsday-ish, that the politicians aren't in charge, and if they are in charge, they've got no interest because they've got lobbyists to deal with, and they've got their own pressures that they've got to deal with. The people down the bottom aren't in charge because their vote doesn't really matter, because if you've got left or right, it's two cheeks to the same bum, as you like to say. When it comes to political assassinations, it just creates a lot of violence and anger on both sides, and then retaliatory effects on both sides, and it just spirals out of control. Philosophically speaking, my good friend, should we just regress and just be bread and circus and watch our Netflix and eat our Doritos and shut the hell up and get on it with it and be my car salesman and just focus on our girlfriends?
So I suppose there's two questions. What makes you happy, right? And there are a lot of people who just put their head over the parapet and think, oh, I don't like that, and just duck back down again and stay much more within their own world, and say, well, I'll just try and control the things that I can control. And I respect that mentality, but I do think it's a bit of an illusion, because effectively that means that somebody else is effectively winding you up and off you go, right? But I can tell you, as a philosopher of many years standing out and asking these hard questions, this is not a comfortable place to be. And it's very interesting that when I was at university, one of my very well-known philosophy tutors warned us at the start of our first year, you will find this an uncomfortable journey. You will find this a difficult journey. You will be confronted with things that you will be surprised to find, and you'll be alarmed about, because what you assumed to be the way the world is not the way the world is. What you will discover is that war and peace are two sides of a single coin rather than actually two separate things. What you will discover is that the people at the top of the pile won't give up their position easily. I mean, a bunch of things like that, right? And so if you want to take this journey, it is uncomfortable. Now, what you do with that is the critical question. There'll be some people who say, I just want to hide and forget about it and go back to where it was. Although actually it was always been thus. You go back a generation or two or three or four and you ask people, as I've done, they would say, we didn't understand, but it wasn't necessarily better. Look at what happened through the First World War and then the Second World War. The Second World War was a result of the First World War not being solved properly, for example. Politicians and those in power are responsible for that. But the point really is there really a choice? If you want to really understand what's going on, as some people do, then you've got no choice but to go down this rather slippery slope. Once you see the landscape, you can begin to think, well, there are levers we can then pull. And just on that, this particular gathering a couple of weekends ago in Melbourne, right? This said something very important to me. This wasn't just neo-Nazis. This was actually a large proportion of the population saying, what we've got at the moment ain't right. That's good. That actually is good, because it shows that there is actually a willingness amongst people to sort of stand out and say, no, this isn't right. We should need more of that. But we need it actually to be done in a way without creating violence and without creating conflict and without creating victims. And one of the things I'm concerned at the moment is when people feel frustrated and angry, they then look to the other, different color skin or whatever, different language or whatever, right? That is the fool's trick that is used by the people in charge to create the conflict, to stop you doing what we really want to do, which is to look very hard at the people in charge.
I've got a super chat here from Dan Harrison. Thank you, Dan. Very powerful super chat. He says, $50, very generous indeed. And it's good to have you back, Dan. We missed you. He says, those that got into Bitcoin even now are about to be the new billionaire class. They are waiting patiently to be in a position where their wealth can be deployed in ways that will do as much good for humanity as fractional fiat has done bad. Very powerful words there. Now, it's no secret that I'm a huge fan of Bitcoin. It's no secret that I am not a fan of fiat, and you are not a fan of fiat either. And I say to all the gold buffs out there, it's not about gold versus Bitcoin. It's not. It's about fiat is broken, and whether you want a yellow rock or a digital yellow rock, that's where there's some debate there. But in any case, what we can see is Bitcoin and gold continue to hit new all-time highs, whilst fiat continues to hit new all-time lows. Now, noting that this is, we would argue, all about money. It's not all about politics in the sense that money talks in Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
Sorry, money and politics. It's the same conversation.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. But what you can see now is that no matter how much politics want to control fiat, you cannot prop up a $37 trillion Ponzi scheme. What are we at now? We're at $37.466 trillion in national debt. Australia's debt is over $1.151 trillion. And both gold and Bitcoin, whether you like one or either or both, continue to hit an all-time high. And then we had Russia, of course, speak recently and say in their post, hey, we know what you're doing, America. We can see your debt. We can see your stable coins. And for everyone out there, stable coins are not Bitcoin. Stable coins are just a digital representation of a dollar that's digital anyway. But in any case, the world is now perhaps saying, well, this is slipping. And it actually all comes together as we agree. Politics and money are deeply intertwined. And when I started doing this channel, everyone's like, Adam, why are you talking about politics? I'm like, because you can't separate politics and money. Yeah. Money and politics are one and the same. Because the politicians write the law who allow the banks to print the money or themselves to print the money, or a Federal Reserve that's not federal or has a reserve of anything to print the money. It dilutes all of your money. Everyone's being stolen from. And that's not done by me. It's not done by Martin. It's not done by Dan Harrison. It's done by whoever's in charge. And then we say, well, who's in charge? Well, the government's in charge. Well, in fact, no, not the government. The people with the money is in charge. It's like, well, who's really got the money? And they say, well, who can print the money? And it's like, well, now we see it. So is it the creature from Jekyll Island? Those who can print the money. I don't care what side of politics you're on. I don't even care what your laws are. I don't care what you're fighting about. So long as I can continue to print money, away we go. But there's only so far we can go with printing money. Now, this is a perfect segue into what's happening with the US dollar. Is this all? So when we say, is this all? The violence, the war, the civil unrest, the friction, the cultural clashes, the breakdown of society, is it all about to reset? Is there going to be a collapse? Is there going to be a war? What happens on the macro next?
Get your crystal ball out and give it a good polish, because I haven't any idea. Look, I think this is going to go on for quite a lot much longer than people think. I think that we're going to see more little wars around the place. I think there's a risk that somebody could make a mistake and it could blow up quite more significantly. But I think that this is all about distraction. And, I often talk about misdirection, the idea of, a magician who wants you to look over here while he's doing something over there. And actually what he's doing over there actually makes the trick work. I think a lot of this conflict and, all of this stuff and this stoking of the left versus right, it's deliberate. It's a misdirection. It stops us asking these harder questions, these deeper questions. Now, when that doesn't work anymore, maybe then they'll have to take the next step, which is, a bit of a war. It'll focus your mind, won't it? And I wouldn't be surprised that somewhere along the line we get a hot war that's a bigger, wider hot war, which is not something that I want. But I come back to the reason that previous wars happened. It happened because of mistakes that politicians made. And I go back to the First World War, which was a stupid war. The Second World War was created because the First World War wasn't solved properly. And my concern is that those people who are in charge do not have the capacity to make the right decisions, good decisions. I'd also make the point, you've got the US debt clock running there. They can continue to blow the debt up dramatically. They could revalue their gold reserves, and that would give them a whole bunch of more assets to enable them to accelerate this even more. They've got the stable coins. They are laying the foundation for continuing this plan for a long, long time. And so whilst there's misdirection and other things, right, the thing we should be looking at is how they actually maintain their grip on money, because money gives you control of society.
Which is actually a perfect segue into Richard's comment here. He says, we need to stop using the elite's money. We have an alternative born from the ashes without a trusted part. We all need to adopt Bitcoin, and power will be given back to the people. So I agree with Richard entirely here, but I understand some people don't. But what we could get consensus on here, I know you want to say something, Martin. Don't worry, I'll get you to jump in there. But so long as we keep buying into this Ponzi scheme, as Richard said, it gives the elites power because we're using their money. If we opt out of this scheme, then they can no longer print that money. And this is the philosophy of Bitcoin. So to everyone here who's not for Bitcoin, I understand I've done 5,500 hours in Bitcoin and I'm still learning. And that's on top of a degree in economics and on top of hosting this channel and on top of being an investor my whole life. The antithesis to the biggest Ponzi scheme in the history of humanity, the antithesis to the biggest scam in humanity, to the money of war, is a money of peace, an open, neutral, borderless, censorship-resistant, scared, hard, sound money. And that is called Bitcoin. Now, many people say, no, Adam, it's a yellow rock. Now, it's nothing against gold, but I can't use gold at the shops. I can't use gold on the internet. I can't test gold every time I receive it. So gold is very slow and cumbersome. That doesn't mean gold doesn't have a value. It just means it's not applicable to the free world and to the modern world. And I can also show that gold doesn't work as a global reserve because I have 5,000 years of data to show you that eventually gold is always centralized. It is double spent. It is then confiscated, and that it is de-linked from the dollar, and then you've got the fiat. And that the solution is like, well, no. What we're going to do this time is now we're going to do it with the BRICS. We're going to have Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and 30 other nations. We're going to centralize the gold. It didn't work with one nation. Now we're going to do it with 30 nations. And it's like we keep going around in circle. Again, it doesn't mean gold doesn't have a value. Where we can get consensus, I think, Martin, where you and I can get consensus is that money is broken. Money is broken so long as they can do the mess that we can see here with forever printing. Whoever gets to print it has all the power. It breaks politics. It breaks the housing market. It breaks freedom. It breaks peace. It creates civil unrest. So we can see in the money markets now, Russia saying, hey, we can see what you're doing, America. America saying, well, hey, we could issue stable coins to prop up our own bonds so we could have the stablecoin companies. It's just a big circle jerk, if you will, where one's a digital dollar propping up itself. And then you have Bitcoin being the antithesis to it. It's a big financial rant to say what's coming on the financial horizon, Martin. The floor is yours.
Oh, wow. Okay, so 3 points quickly. Central banks are part of the problem rather than the solution. They are actually there to enable governments to support themselves through financing. In the process, they have got this lever to do with inflation, which is a very bad lever. The whole 2% thing was a New Zealand invention some time ago, and it's been taken by everybody to be, the way to do it. No, central banks, if I had my way, the monetary function of central banks would be abolished immediately. They are part of the problem rather than the solution, first point. Second point, the continued growth of the number, because they just create more and more and more and more and more, which means that the value goes down and down and down and down and down, is effectively a continued devaluation of everything that you own and everything that you hold. A lot of people don't realize it, but that dollar in your pocket is worth less now than it was a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, and that will continue. It has always done this. It's a deliberate thing. Now they increase the number, so you've got this wealth effect, but the wealth effect is, it's illusory. It's not real at all. It just means you've got big and zeros on the end of your number. It doesn't mean anything more than that. The house values haven't gone up. The value has gone down because the value of the dollar has gone down. So that's why house prices continue to rise. And as you increase the liquidity in the system, that will go on happening. The third point is, at some point, is this going to collapse in on itself? And, do we have, note that a lot of central banks outside the US now hold more gold than US treasuries. That's quite a significant observation. So we've got this now suggestion of maybe there is going to be an alternative, but most people are saying, well, what is the alternative? The alternative is going to be maybe the yuan or something else. I don't know. So most of the people inside the system are happy for the system to continue because they are still benefiting from it. Unfortunately, the bulk are not. Can we transfer to a Bitcoin? Well, it's not necessarily something you can do without a sort of a alt control delete reset. Is that likely? Is that possible? Well, it is possible, but if you look at what the US is doing, they are trying to keep the existing fiat system alive again. Stablecoins is part of the strategy. They are quite deliberately trying to keep the dollar a bit weaker than where it was, but still there at the center of everything because it benefits the US in particular. And the question I've got is, are those people who actually hold those cards likely to give them up? I don't think they will.
So some really good comments here. Last independent thinker says, lol, so many red pills. Yes, there sure are. Pig's Place is saying, glad I'm a bit of a prepper sometimes, just in case. Absolutely. I like it. Just think of prepping. I know some people get upset by prepping, but I prepare every time I drive my car by putting my seatbelt on. That doesn't mean that I'm some prepper where I'm obsessed by putting my seatbelt on. It's like, no, well, first of all, it's the law. Second of all, I don't want the bing, bing, bing from my car going off. Third of all, why not? Just throw your seatbelt on. And when it comes to prepping Pig's Place, it doesn't hurt to have a bit of food, a bit of water, maybe a bit of ammo if you've got access to weapons and if you're in the right jurisdiction and you've got the right laws in place. It doesn't hurt to be prepared. That's why I say at a minimum, make sure your body is prepared. Make sure you are fit to the extent that you can walk. Check out my survival series where I talk about the rules of survival. And of course, Ramsey is going to harass me about the next episode of the survival series, which is most certainly water. Down Under says stealth, wealth, and prepping. Yeah, that's right. To maybe don't flaunt your wealth so much. It's sometimes difficult though when you live in certain neighborhoods or people know what you do for a living. I just want to show everyone here the gold chart. And first of all, you're looking at Bitcoin to US dollars. In the big picture, I'll just go to weeklies here. And if everyone thinks, well, what's this got to do with an assassination? I want you to remember that what we're talking about here is that there's a belief, a valid belief, that all of this is happening to distract us. All of the division is to distract us. Now, this is a Bitcoin chart that you're seeing. It's up to the right in the weeklies. And now I bring up the gold chart. And the gold chart is up and to the right as well. So these charts look very similar, is in they just keep gaining more and more nominal value. Gold doesn't buy more purchasing power. Gold, to be blunt, gold has not gained more purchasing power. Bitcoin has gained more purchasing power. But gold has definitely beat inflation, and in the sense that it doesn't get affected by inflation. It's always been a hedge against inflation, whereas the dollar is, it is in itself inflation, as it's constantly printed and constantly being eroded. I want to bring this back to what happened in the States. So let's put our tinfoil hats on. You had probably a 200-yard shot, I'm assuming a 5.56 to the throat, as you can see. Well, I don't have to assume to it's the throat. You saw it. Although I did hear some speculation that Charlie had a bulletproof vest on and it deflected off his vest onto his throat. Based on the footage I saw, I can't substantiate that. But in any case, it was a shot to the throat and you bled out almost instantly. You can see also there was machete attacks in Australia, in Melbourne, where two boys, a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old, were killed with machetes. You can see that there was that terrible stabbing in America, a horrific stabbing, where a black person stabbed a white girl or a white young woman, Ukrainian, in the throat, and she bled out very quickly and died on the train. And the only response from the viewers, or I should say from the viewers, even though they're fellow passengers, was they took out their phones and they took a photo of the girl bleeding out on the floor of the train. We've touched on it before, if it's all smoke and mirrors, if it's all by design to distract us from the collapsing of a dollar, from the collapsing of the financial system, and there's a war, as you suggested, hey, there's a war over here, this will distract you for a while. So you've had your gender wars, you've had your race wars, you've had your sexuality wars, now you've got your political wars, and now, by the way, here's a kinetic war. But what we haven't touched on, or what we haven't experienced yet, is an uprising for a class war. That is an actual fiscal war. And I'm not talking about the rich versus the poor, or the lower class versus the middle class versus the upper class. I'm talking about everyone versus the 0.00001 percenters, those who are printing the money and pulling the strings. What's the solution beyond taking to the streets, as you touched on before, with flags, when your government says that's un-Australian? Just unbelievable, and calls you a right-wing Nazi? How dare you, Australia, fly your flag in Australia peacefully and walk in the streets, exercising your democratic right in a democratic society? What's the solution? Do you opt out? Do you go for gold? Do you go for the property markets? Do you go and flee to another country? Where do we go, Martin?
Yeah, it's not easy because, of course, the things that we're seeing in Australia are also there in other places too, including the UK and pretty much all Western countries. It is an interesting question. I've had a number of one-to-one conversations in the last few months with people who live in Australia and are just saying Australia is not a place I can see living in long term, but where are the alternatives? And the truth is there are no simple alternatives. There are a few that might be interesting. Cost of living a lot lower in some Asian countries, but there are some downsides there. The UK or Europe has some nice things about it, but also has some less nice things too. So running away may or may not be an answer. I do think that the truth of the matter is that there are more people now waking up to this idea that things are not right. And that's good. I actually think that's a good thing rather than a bad thing. But what we have to do is to find a way of pointing that queasiness, that unease, into something that's positive and productive rather than negative and destructive. That's the critical question. Now, unfortunately, most of the political parties aren't very good at doing that. There's just two major parties nowhere at all in terms of actually dealing with the issues. And even the minor parties tend to be issue-driven, like net zero or whatever, rather than actually taking this slightly more philosophical point. But there is a very important question here, and I keep coming back to this, and I'll come back to it again. The future is genuinely malleable. You can change it. You can make changes if you want to, but you have to, one, understand what's going on, and two, make a determined, view of, well, we're going to change something, or we're going to do this, that, and the other. So at the moment, I don't think we're off first base. So a lot of people just say it's not right, but that's as far as people go. So the first thing is to try and help people understand a bit more about what's really going on, which is what I try to do on my channel, and you do here as well. But then there are levers potentially beyond that. But the journey is going to be difficult. It's going to be costly, and it's going to be uncomfortable, because what it means is that the eternal verities, the things you assume to be correct, may not be correct. Think about what the implications of that is for the education system, right? Because at the moment, if you think about it, when you go to school, you are taught how economics works, the standard way at the moment. Debt's part of the process. I remember being taught that at school. So education system will need to change. The financial system would need to change. The whole question of the value of different occupations would need to change. Why is it that bankers are paid 50 times more than nurses? When in fact, I would argue that nurses are 50 times more valuable than bankers. So here's a little conundrum for you. And I just want to share this meme here, right? Because I think it's very relevant. It's back to front, whether you can see it. But we live in a time when intelligent people are being silenced so that stupid people won't be offended. That is part of the problem too, because we are going to actually offend people when we start talking about this stuff. And we're going to have people throw their hands up in horror and say, you can't say that. Just as I was accused of being negative with regard to property prices when I said, well, there is a scenario that says property prices could fall, right? The truth is, this is a very uncomfortable journey. Do you really want to go on it? That's the question I often throw with people. Do you really want to go down this rabbit hole? But what's the alternative? The alternative is more of the same old, more of this continued inflation, more of this slavery. That's where we are at the moment. So there's an alternative, but yeah, it's not a simple journey from this point.
Who killed Charlie Kirk? Now, when I say who killed, I don't mean the individual. I say, was it the state that killed him? When I say the state, I mean the creature from Jekyll Island, whoever they are. Okay, we need to stir the pot. We need some more civil unrest. We're going to pay this guy to get on a roof and take a 200-meter shot. Was it an ideologically subverted, mentally impaired person who fell for the narrative of hate, right-wing bad, anyone who doesn't think our way bad, we have the moral high ground, we have the moral social justice right to kill anyone on the right or who is not on the left? Was it just someone who wanted attention? In your opinion, is it on one end, it's just an individual acting individually, doing his or her own thing, or it's something much bigger where someone was actually sponsored, here's your rifle, here's your shot, here's your money, go do it, or is it something in between?
where are you on the conspiriometer, right? Between one and the other. I mean, it's difficult to know, isn't it? My own perspective has been, I've tended to believe that there are people who will be heavily influenced, and feel they want to actually make a mark, and have the wherewithal to do it. I think that was probably what happened with the first Trump attempt. It was an individual. No evidence that it was actually state-backed. But then you go back to the Kennedy story, and was that state-based? Who knows? Of course, the US is very, very good at talking about conspiracy theories. And when I start talking about what I'm talking about here, people say, "Oh, you're doing the old conspiracy thing then, are you?" Well, I'm not quite the same, but I am actually recognizing that perhaps sometimes it's important to ask these questions. I don't know, Adam, is the true answer. I don't know whether it was actually something that was, special ops, or whether it was an individual, or whether it was actually, some other thing. What I will say is, if you compare now with a few generations ago, we do seem to have greater mental instability in society. We have, of course, more people who perhaps a few generations ago would have been locked away now out in society, and you've got to give them their freedom, etc., etc. And you've also got, with this social media thing, more people who are more easily influenced and more gullible, so they don't necessarily have their filters tuned to say, "Oh, hang on a moment, that can't be right." And I actually think that, frankly, it's all to do with the evolution of society. But just go back to the gas pipelines that were mined. Do you remember the ones that were mined a couple of years ago from near Norway? It's now been, I think,
Nordstrom.
Yeah, Nordstrom. I think it's now been confirmed that actually they were people from Ukraine who did it, right? And so when you come back to it, often there is more of a state activation than you might want to see, but it's hard to know, right? I personally think it's probably not going to be state ops direct, but I come back to my broader point. This is the result of the social media, the result of everything that we've been talking about this evening. But there will be people who'll be quite happy to see this, resurrection, reaffirmation of the left or the right. It's them that's the problem. That is what I get amazed about. We're all human beings after all. We're all part of the same tribe, believe it or not. We're on one planet. If we blow the planet up, we haven't got another one we can run to. Even Elon Musk isn't ready to run yet. So it's about time we looked after ourselves and our brothers a bit better, and actually thought about talking rather than actually warring, in my view.
What was so confronting to me, Martin, is many people have probably seen the footage. You see a man on stage sitting down with a microphone, puts a microphone down, gets a bullet long range to the throat. A lot of blood pours out, bleeds out virtually immediately, and it's game over. That's confronting, but I've seen that stuff before, so I'm not immune to it, but probably desensitized to it. What was more concerning to me, what was more confronting to me, and it's not taking away from the horrific act itself, was seeing so many people dance on a dead man's grave, like celebrating, "Yay, this is so good, this is so wonderful." Typically, people with, there's a pattern, one side of, I know, but it is what it is, facial piercings, dyed hair, lots of tattoos, lots of soy, on one side of politics, saying, "Yeah, we're about love, inclusion, peace and tolerance, but hey, this is so fantastic that this guy was just killed. A father, a human, an American, a white guy, a Christian, how dare he?" And what was good is that Obama and Biden, if it was Biden, I don't know, and even Elizabeth Warren came forward and said, this is not on. But you saw, I don't know if you saw in Congress, they said, "Oh, we want to have a moment of silence." And of course there was some, I nearly swore then, radical who goes like, "No." And it's like, this is where it concerns me. Okay, you're always going to have an outlier. So in any organization, in defense, in police, in ambulance, in medical, in teaching, there's always going to be some random who ruins it for everyone. Got it. But what concerned me the most about this was when so many people were so celebratory, if that's a word, coming forward and saying, "Yeah, this is a really good thing." It's like, wow, is this where we've come to, where humans us celebrating the slaughtering of a father on stage, and I think his family was there with him at the time, that really upset me. Now, equally, what I can see is that the right, or those who don't agree with slaughtering someone for using words, they now counter this and say, well, hang on, not only have you killed a martyr, a leader, a father, a human, an American, but you're now dancing on the grave of this person. And consequently, you can see that there's a lot of friction bubbling up to the surface there. So it's one thing for you and I to sit in our ivory towers, per se, and say, well, we need to talk. But the reality is, for many years, there's been a lot of talk, and there's also been a lot of violence. And when you can see people being killed and stabbed and slaughtered, and people are getting hungry and they can't get a house, and everyone feels like a victim, wrongly or rightly, and those at the top keep getting richer and richer. And I like your example about a banker getting 20, 50, 100 times more than what the nurse does, but they provide a 20th of the value, or 200, how much did you say, 200 times more, whatever it was. That creates a disconnect. And I don't know if you saw in Australia, the ANZ reported, what was it, $6.5 billion in profit, and then sacked 4,500 people. I'm like, and the first thing is like, well, it's not about profits. It's like, dude, well, what's it about then? If you're not there for profits, which you are, and it's okay, just admit it. But if you've just made $6.5 billion in profits, and then you sack all of these people, and now they're homeless and they're stressed, it's just another layer of financial stress. It's a long lead in to say, is war coming? And the pre-question to that is, do we have a civil war first amongst ourselves, which then escalates into a global war, or is there already enough global tension where war will kick off anyway?
Well, there is clearly, conflict within society in many places, and we certainly see that in Australia and in the UK and elsewhere as well. Like I say, I believe that's being, stoked a little bit rather than actually being calmed down. But it comes back to what I said earlier on. There is a risk, I think, of a bigger war, but of course the war is expensive. War is inflationary, and the problem with war is that it's unpredictable. Now, I believe we're in the situation now where the US believes it's number one. It probably still is. But I think China's coming up on the outside with a lot of its capability, as we saw in the marches the other week. And there are other players there. Trouble is, it's going to be dirty, and it's going to be a different sort of war. We saw the drones, for example, in Ukraine, and the way that war is being fought there. It's very different now. So if you want to let that Pandora out the box, that is something you probably can't put back in. So I hope cool of heads will prevail. But looking at what's happening in the Middle East at the moment, I wonder. And so I still think there is a risk of a broader war. Hope it doesn't happen. It won't be good for anybody if it does. But I do come back to the more immediate issue. We've got war within society. We've got war within communities. It's being stoked. It's being deliberately. And I just want to leave you with this thought. Truth cannot be silenced with violence. And I think that's what I would like to highlight, that actually there is something beyond violence. You cannot allow violence to silence truth. And actually the beauty of what we've been able to do, and continue to do hopefully for a long time, is to talk about things in a respectful way, and to probe at ideas and concepts. If we lose the ability to do that, then we've lost a different war.
Which leaves us with this. The solution to all of this. Okay, so what are the options? Let's go through the spectrum. You take up arms, you march on the streets with flags, you run for politics, or you get a lot of money. Now maybe, or you take the blue pill and just go live in a tent somewhere. But even then, someone's going to come and get you. So you've got all these different options. My belief, my experience is, I thought politics was the answer, but then I realized, no, the politicians aren't in charge. They do as they're told. And then I wish I was wrong, but I have no data to suggest that I am wrong. I hope and pray and am very happy to be corrected on that, but I think you agree with me there. So then I look at money, and I said, well, maybe money's the answer. So when it came to vax time, and I've had lots of vaxes in my life, but I didn't have the COVID vax, because whenever you ask questions, they'd be like, you're a racist. It's like, what? I just want to know what's in this thing that you're going to inject in my body. And your response is, you're a racist. It's like, how the hell does racism come into needles? I just want to know what you're about to inject into my body. And because the pushback on that was so, I was going to say violent, but in some instances it was very extreme. I like, well, hang on, there's something dodgy here, because if I can't ask questions, there's something definitely they're covering up. And later on we can see strokes and deaths and so forth. Even medical protections are saying, so I was right there. But what protected me from that was money. Because I have and had money then as well, I didn't have to worry about, hey, if you don't take this vax, you can't go to work. And if you can't go to work, you can't earn money. And if you can't earn money, well, you're on the street. And then we go to, if you look at Elon Musk as an example, love or hate him, because he's got so much money, he was able to acquire the platform that was controlling speech. Now, some might say, well, now he's controlling speech. Well, whatever. The reality is whoever had the money controlled the platform, who controlled the speech. So in my opinion, money is the answer to free us from this, because then I can't be coerced, I can't be controlled. And then the extension to that is, well, if I use your broken money, your corrupt, centralized, fiat printed, bank controlled money, money of war, then am I really in control? So then I started to look for an alternative, or maybe the alternative found me, which in my world is Bitcoin, in other people's world it's gold, and in other people's world it's stocks or whatever. But for me, in my opinion, my experience, it's Bitcoin. So I bring it all to this. If you want to check out, if you want to change where we are now, do we riot on the street? Do we hold flags? Do we run for politics? Do we earn money? Or do we take the blue pill and live out in the bush?
Well, I can't get back into the blue pill land. I'm too far out. I've asked too many questions, and the more questions I ask, the more questions I want to ask. It's who I am. So to my mind, there is no way back into that world. In terms of making change, I've believed fundamentally that we have to think differently about the way that politics works, which is essentially, rather than the top down, thou shalt do, the bottom up is the way to do it. And with the internet and with social media, that's more possible today. And, I think that's a good way to think about it. I do think that, you and I are both fortunate enough to be at least wealthy enough not to have to worry about where the next meal is coming from. Now, unfortunately, in my surveys, a lot of households aren't in that position. So whatever they might choose to do or want to do, they are constrained by their need to go to work, to feed themselves, to go to work, to feed themselves, to go to work, to feed themselves. And that's always going to be a limiting factor. But as we go down this winding road, and more people than ever are saying, hang on a moment, this isn't right. It doesn't feel as though this is something that I can, feel comfortable about. There is an opportunity to begin to craft a different route, but it has to be a route that has momentum around a relatively large volume of people to be able to make a difference. And that means that by definition, like it or not, you're going to have to play in some political sphere in some way. Now, it may not be the major parties, it might be another force in politics. But the truth is that politics ultimately is going to have to be the way that this is done, because the other alternative is to, people's revolution and all that sort of, well, that just turned out really well with the Peasants' Revolt, etc., isn't it? So maybe the political route is actually the least worst option, but it's not straightforward. It's not easy. But at least step one is we want people to think and ask questions, because at least if you think and ask questions, that's a good sort of initial step. I don't think the money solution is actually going to be the right one, by the way. It won't get you to where you need to get to.
Unfortunately, this conversation has left me with more questions than answers, but that's what I expect from a good philosopher, to really challenge our thoughts. Look, we're coming up to time. I'm very grateful for your time tonight. We didn't actually plan, obviously, to speak about this. We had booked this in a few days ago, but then, of course, I think it was only fitting that we spoke about it today. I give the message to everyone out there, it's been a horrible day. It's been a horrible day where someone who used a microphone to communicate was slaughtered with a weapon of death to stop that communication. It's been a horrible experience to see so many people dance on the grave of someone who was slaughtered. It's been reassuring that we saw some political leaders such as Biden, Obama, and Warren step forward and say, this is not on. This is not what we do. We've even seen, to an extent, some Australian politicians say the same thing. This is not how it works. And if we have to resort to hot lead flying through the air because we don't like a word that comes out of someone's mouth, that's dangerous. And we think about the philosophers of the past, Martin, where philosophy, these great debates that they have together, they'd gather in arenas, and it would almost be a show where philosophers would come together and they would come up with a concept and they would debate one another. And I certainly remember in high school being on the debating team, and it didn't matter what the topic was. You were given a topic, and then you were given a side, and then you fought it out with words. There was no violence, there was no offence. But now it seems that it's almost dangerous to talk. When we go into Australia, before I let you go, are you hopeful for Australia, noting that you left us?
Oh, sure. Look, I am a great believer in the potential that Australia has to become a great country again in the future. It has the resources, it has the land, it has some great people there, but unfortunately our leaders have let us badly down. So if we do shift the goalposts a little bit and say, well, hang on, we're not just going to play this big corporate game anymore, we're going to play a different game. And if we invest in building society and building a better future for everybody, then yes, it has huge potential, huge opportunity. It's probably one of the best places to live. But it means that effectively some of the fundamental assumptions that we've been living with for the last 30 to 40 to 50 years, neoliberalism, for example, and the idea that central banks know best, just two examples. The third one, of course, being that the corporates are actually just there to help us. Those things need to be actually really put under the microscope. And therefore, my question is, how do we start that journey? Well, we start with one step. And, if you believe that Australia is cooked, then I'd suggest to you that the majority of the Western economies in the world are cooked as well, because Australia has significant resources and significant opportunity relative to many others. So, I'm actually not completely unhopeful, but I also believe that if we continue down the journey that we're going down and where Albo is taking us at the moment, we're going to see more violence on the streets. We're going to see more contention. We're going to see more of this winners and losers battle going on. And homing people will become even more difficult. Costs of property will continue to rise. And the bottom line will be that more and more people will get further and further away from feeling comfortable about themselves and the world that they're part of. And I just want to highlight again, the future is malleable. And, whenever I finish these conversations, I remind everybody, we can make things different if we choose to, but we have to choose to. We have to make choices. Or we take the blue pill and just carry on regardless.
Powerful words. And if anyone has got value out of this, hit subscribe, because it's not just about a vanity metric. It's about what Martin's saying here. If we can talk and we can challenge each other's ideas and we can do it in long format, that is part of the change. Martin is on a mission. I'm on a mission. It's not about violence. It's not about marching in the street. It's about using the technology that we have at our fingertips and the power of the word, of conversation, of thinking, of challenging thoughts. And of course, Martin is a philosopher, and I too am an understudy of your philosophical preachings, if you will, Martin, because if we can't challenge our own ideas, then we have no possibility of challenging someone else's ideas. If it's just like, no, this is the way it is, there's not much hope. Now, of course, if people want to learn more from you, they can check out your channel, Walk the World. They can also go to your webpage. Just give yourself a little plug before we close off.
Yeah, so I have my blog at digitalfinanceanalytics.com. I'm also on Twitter And you can find me there as well. And I'll just give you a little bit of a plug here. If I just flick this over, just make me full screen for a second. So I issued a show the other day called "You Can't Make This Stuff Up." Our latest economic update. That was my conversation with Nugget about all of this stuff, across the top. But it gave a really good overview of all the things that we've been talking about, and trying to actually understand how all of these various elements, gold, conflict, housing, is all connected. So, we are trying to preach the gospel. We're trying to help people actually find their way, and perhaps be a bit of a light on the hill in this uncertain time. And I come back to one simple final thought. We are individuals. We are part of a community. Those communities are really valuable and important. And therefore, from the point of view of how we think about the future, we need to think about the future, not from a top down, thou shalt do this, but from a bottom up, what can we do?
Powerful words, Martin. Go over and support Martin at Walk the World. Martin North, I'm very grateful for your time. Viewers, if you got any value out of this, hit like, share and subscribe. Martin, thank you for joining me tonight.
I've enjoyed it, and even if the occasion was a sad one, I hope that people got value from it, and I look forward to the next one.